Wayne's asking about how do you determine the output associated with the minimum average variable cost? What is the value of average variable cost at this minimum? Well, whenever I see these words, if something associated with the minimum of an equation, what's the minimum? What is the quantity associated with the minimum value of this or the maximum value of this? How do I maximize profits later on? Then you can usually presume that there's some kind of calculus going on. Because I'm talking about, well, the minimum average variable cost is going to be the bottom of a slope, the bottom of a curve. So if I have this slide 819, which I guess is figure 8.5, I've got this average variable cost curve, and well, at least in this picture, its minimum is occurring at this output Q2. And if I remember things about taking derivatives, then I can always find the minimum points by looking at, and the maximums, I can always find the minimum points by figuring out where does the slope equal 0. So for output levels less than Q2, the average variable cost curve is falling, so it has a negative slope. And for output levels greater than Q2, average variable cost is rising, so it has a positive slope. But right at its minimum, its slope is equal to 0. If I had an equation for average variable cost, then you would just want to say, well, how can I use that equation for average variable cost and figure out where its minimum point is? Well, you need to know where its slope equals 0. So you could just say, well, I'm going to take the derivative of that average variable cost equation and set it equal to 0, because that will tell me where the minimum point is. If you had an equation for short run marginal cost and you wanted to know where is its minimum, at what quantity does it reach its minimum, then you say, well, if I have a short run marginal cost equation, then I could take the derivative of that and set it equal to 0. So whatever quantity is associated with that derivative equaling 0 will be the quantity that occurs at that minimum. Once you have your average variable cost, or whatever, if you have an average total cost equation, you take those derivatives, set them equal to 0, and solve those for Q. Then the values of Q that come out of that will always be the quantities associated with those minimum. How do you determine the output associated with average variable cost at its minimum? Figure out where that equation, where the derivative of that equation is equal to 0, because that'll give you its minimum point, or its maximum. And so once you know, if you know that Q3 is the output associated with the minimum average total cost, because you've figured out the derivative of the average total cost equation and set that equal to 0 when you solve it and you got Q3 out of it, then you can say, well, I'm just going to take Q3 and plug it into the average total cost equation, and you should get some amount of average total cost that's equal to that. If I said, well, it looks like if I took the derivative of my average total cost equation and set it equal to 0, I would get a quantity of 400 associated with that. If I then, so I take the derivative of the ATC equation, set it equal to 0, and I end up solving it, and I would get a value of Q equal to 400. Well, then if I took 400, a Q equal to 400, and plugged that into my ATC equation, I would get an average total cost of somewhere around 50, it looks like. So the second part of your question was, how do you know the value of AVC or ATC at its minimum? Well, take the quantity where you know the minimum happens and just plug it into that ATC or AVC equation, and it should give you the 50 in this case.